Let's start with the Fort Hood massacre and the dangerous person who nobody stopped. Here's what we know. The FBI knew that Major Nadal Malik Hassan had email communications over the past 2 years with a known radical cleric living in Yemen who has used his website to encourage Muslims to kill U.S. troops in Iraq. The imam also had been in touch with 2 of the 9/11 hijackers. And how in a lecture during medical school 2 years ago, Major Hassan advocated that the military should allow Muslim soldiers to be excused from fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan or else face, quote, adverse events. We also know that Major Hassan engaged in arguments with fellow classmates and soldiers about why he thought both wars were wrong. Former CIA officer Bob Bears, an intelligence columnist with Time.com, and NBC News counterterrorism analyst Roger Cressy was a member of the National Security Council. I want to start with Bob. What do you make of this? The FBI had a look at this guy. They saw that he was talking, engaging in emails back and forth with this imam over in Yemen who's been calling on Muslims worldwide to attack U.S. soldiers. We know he spoke out in a very dramatic way, passionate way against the wars over there, saying that they're anti-Muslim and questioning whether Muslims shouldn't get CO status to avoid having to go into combat over there. A lot of information from fellow workers, fellow students, that this guy's been speaking out as a Muslim against the war, against what he believes is a war against Islam. Why didn't he get stopped?
Chris, he didn't commit a crime. This imam we're talking about, Laki, is emailing thousands of people in this country. All of them are being looked at. The FBI, as I understand, somebody told me today, we had this guy under investigation, Major Hassan. They were looking to see if he was part of a bigger network. In any intelligence operation like this, you have to pull in all the threads. If you jump on a suspect right away, you could miss somebody else. And they were looking at these guys. So I don't really think we can call it an intelligence failure right now unless something emerges we don't know about.
Well, my question is, why didn't his military command above him and their aptitude reports on him, when they're getting all this information about him, or aren't they getting it, would have put it all together and said, don't send this guy into a combat zone. Don't send him overseas. Why didn't that happen? Forget prosecution. Why deployment?
Let me speculate on this, and I doubt that the military command knew about the emails. I mean, these things are intercepted abroad by the National Security Agency, who holds them very tightly for a good reason. Now, the question, did Army CID, criminal investigation side of the Army, find out about it? And usually no. This stuff is all compartmented, even after 9/11. And I don't think we can really, say this is the Army's fault. They may not have known.
What about the FBI?
The FBI, at 20/20 hindsight, yes, they should have jumped on the guy, take him away. They should have looked at gun registrations, see that he bought a gun fairly recently, the fact that he had 2. They should have called in witnesses. But remember, the FBI, as we speak today, is overwhelmed with the number of leads. They're literally tens of thousands each day that are coming up.
Well, Roger Cressy, thanks for joining us as well. What amazes me is, well, what worries me is that there are many people like this who meet this description, who come from this background, who have voiced opposition to the war, and have been in communication with somebody like the imam. If there are many people like this, we have a real problem. If this guy's unique in this regard of having all these dots connected, then something should have been done. It's one or the other. Either there's a lot of guys like this and women in the military who have this conflict in their souls, or there's only one. Why didn't they act in either case?
Well, Chris, to Bob's point, it sounds kind of crazy, but it is not a crime to be in communication with a known al-Qaeda sympathizer. Anwar al-Awlaki is not part of the al-Qaeda network. He's not an operative, so he's not on anybody's prohibited list, but he's a person of tremendous concern. I think where the system broke down on this one is, yeah, the FBI was up on him. 2 different joint terrorism task forces were looking at the electronic intercepts. They were looking at his performance reviews as well, and they did not see anything that was threat-specific, which is the first trigger. In all the OERs that they reviewed during the course of this investigation, they didn't see anything out of the ordinary there, so that was the second trigger that didn't happen. Where I have a big question is, if you're going to be in regular contact with someone like al-Awlaki, somebody in Army counterintelligence should at the very least have been told about it, and the Army should have approached Hassan and said, we understand that you are having issues and difficulties dealing with things associated with your job. That didn't happen, and we don't know why.
Okay, let's take a look at something he said back 2 years ago in a lecture. It's a lecture delivered at medical school 2 years ago. Major Hassan said, quote, "It's getting harder and harder for Muslims in the service to morally justify being in a military that seems constantly engaged against fellow Muslims." He also wrote, quote, "Department of Defense should allow Muslim soldiers the option of being released as conscientious objectors to increase troop morale and decrease adverse events." Boy, the guy's laying it on the line here. And on one of his slide presentations in that lecture, he wrote, quote, "We love death more than you love life," citing the attitude about people who engage in jihad. It just strikes me, Bob, that this guy was basically laying out the situation, and nobody was paying attention.
No, I don't think we don't have a political intelligence service that collects on Americans. The FBI does it, but they don't have enough people. We just don't have anything like that in place.
Well, what about his colleagues? Weren't they afraid and saw this guy giving what's supposed to be a lecture on medicine and uses it as an opportunity to give this Jeremiah and saying you got to have CO status for guys like me who have real religious difficulties with going to war with our fellow religious? I mean, and then constantly rapping about this in the service with his colleagues over and over again saying, I got a real problem with this war in Islam because we're killing Muslims all the time, and I'm a Muslim, and I don't want to do it. And then he gets sent overseas, and he obviously gets sprung. And I guess the question is, Roger Cressy, not whether he should have been prosecuted for having loose lips or attitude or even anti-American attitudes at the point of disagreeing with the war, although we all in this show oftentimes express similar views about the decisions to go to war with Iraq, the decisions even to prosecute or escalate the war in Afghanistan. They're not considered criminal. In fact, in a free country, they're part of the joy of being an American. But this guy was under stress. And I wonder why nobody noticed.
So, Chris, he was definitely under stress, but everything you just related is all protected by free speech and is all perfectly legal. The gray area when it comes to dealing with terrorism threats, and Bob and I have both dealt with this when we were both in government, is when you have incomplete information, you got to make a judgment call on someone. If you don't see specific triggers in their pattern of behavior that allows you to say, you know what, we got to bring this guy in, or we think he's actually going to become violent, it's a real tough call. In hindsight, the Army should have seen warning signs here and at least approached him or taken him out of the pattern for deployment. What we don't know is whether or not the Army said, hey, even if there are problems with him, we need to have more psychiatrists overseas because of all the problems that we're having in the battlefields right now. So regardless of his situation, we needed him overseas. And did they miss the warning signs in the process of doing that?
Bob, you know what struck me was the president today, using such strong language, and it's so fitting, unfortunately, with the environment we're in right now, talking about how this guy's going to be punished in the next life as well as in this. I mean, here's the president. Let's listen to him. This is extraordinary language, almost biblical language for a president to engage in such a moment. This is at the Fort Hood Memorial Service today.
It may be hard to comprehend the twisted logic that led to this tragedy, but this much we do know. No faith justifies these murderous and craven acts. No just and loving God looks upon them with favor. For what he has done, we know that the killer will be met with justice in this world and the next.
Bob Baer, your thoughts on that extraordinary statement by a president of the United States on such a religious matter, how a person will be punished in the afterlife for a crime that, they have to be convicted of it, of course, but we know what we're talking about here.
Well, I think it was a mistake. I mean, if this man, the major, was driven by religion, last thing we want to do is evoke religion on our part. This is not a war against religion, a clash of civilizations we're fighting. It's a war against terrorism. So to evoke God, I think, was a mistake on his part. But this is exactly where we're heading, day by day on this whole war on terror. The longer we stay in Iraq, the longer we stay in Afghanistan, I guarantee you the more shootings and the more bombings we're going to see like this. It's just inevitable.
Well, I have to say that I agree with that sentiment and that observation. For ever since 9/11 now, and even if you go back to Somalia, the United States, every time there's a war on television worldwide, on any network worldwide, they're watching Americans shooting Muslims and being shot back at and being killed by IEDs. It's a war with a consistent theme. Us on one side, Islamists, if you will, on the other side, but clearly Islamic people on the other side. Your thoughts, Roger?
Well, I think whenever you see this type of environment where, through the internet especially, Chris, and so much of the self-radicalization has happened through the internet, the people downloading what I call jihadi porn on a regular basis, and the other images we've seen on TV as well, if someone is mentally disturbed to begin with, and they feel despair and anger and no hope of an alternative path, then the likelihood of them resorting to violent means is exponentially higher. You know, I think the biggest issue that the Army is going to have to deal with, and the other armed services are going to look at this too, is, was this an isolated case about one person motivated by religion, by other events, and decided to take up arms against his fellow soldiers? If they believe that's the case, then you handle it one way. If they believe this is symptomatic of a broader problem, the Army is going to have a serious introspection they got to go through and make a series of changes in how they deal with people now undergoing stress, both overseas as well as domestically.
Yeah, I think it's the former. I don't think this is a stress situation. I think this is a problem unique to this religious situation we're in right now, which is extraordinary, and it's going to get worse. Thank you very much, Bob Baird. Thank you, Roger Cressy.